Good morning. Hey, just spent some time out on the course this morning, not golfing. I was actually doing a little fly fishing. There's a historic creek that runs through this historic course called Rays Creek, and turns out there's no trout to be had in Rays Creek. Um, just a little trivia, if you can tell me what course I'm on this morning, and I'm trying to keep things moving and moving around to different places, but if you can tell me the name of the course and the whole number that I happen to be on, there will be a little bit of extra credit on one of your assignments tied in. You need to be the first one. You can see there's some water behind me here. You can look over my left shoulder. Over my right shoulder, there we go, that way, is the tee box. And the hint I will give you is that you do not need a driver or a 3-wood to get to this green. It's an iron off of the tee. And just location wise, you can see that pin is top left, which is historically a Saturday location, just as another little side hint. So first one to let me know where I'm at, there'll be a prize. I'm going to dive into sharing my screen. And I promised you the last one would, I was going for 12 minutes and it ended up to 17. So we're going to try to do a little bit better job of keeping this one a little bit shorter. So I'm going to go into sharing my screen. And there we are. And we will get at it. This is part 2 of chapter 8 in terms of, and I'm not going to go through everything, but just a reminder, this slide right here, probably the key slide of part 1, the 5 stages of group development. That's they spent some time in the chapter extensively on that, and an important part. As we move into part 2, one of the things we're going to talk about right away is decision making, and knowing what stage of group development that your group or your team is in really will impact the way that you make decisions. So kind of a little precursor to what we're going to go to. And then this is where we ended up talking about some of the dysfunctional roles, and they're out there and you have to deal with them, and moves us into group decision making. So just a reminder again, as you think about many aspects of being in management and how you motivate, how you make decisions, how you work with the people within your group, your team, your department, whatever that might be, understanding that there's, while we give often rules of thumb about how to do things, there's going to be factors that play into the way you're going to operate as a manager. What, like as I just mentioned, what stage you're in, the capability of your group members will really impact that. We saw that in chapter 1, autocratic management style, often for people who have low capability, low motivation. You pretty much just got to tell them this is the way we do it, and as they grow and develop as team members, you will vary the way that you work with them and communicate with them and so forth. And this is true in decision making as well. Rule of thumb, and they're listed there. I don't need to read word for word for you, but just as you make decisions, think about the context that you fall in as a team or as a group, and how you would make those decisions, and then ultimately be purposeful, inclusive, empowering, process-oriented, and ethical. And as you get through the development of teams, you'll want to get people to a place where there's consensus, particularly as they develop as individuals on that team as well. Here's the big elephant in the room, conflict, and myself included. Most of us don't like handling and dealing with conflict. We would most often hope it goes away, or just don't deal with it, or deal with it inappropriately. And this is probably one of the biggest challenges as a manager, of dealing with conflict and how we work through that. As you work through the stages of groups, you will see this most in the storming side of things. Again, reminder, we have forming, storming, norming, performing, and termination, or adjourning is the word that I threw in there to stick with the INGs. But as you're kind of getting to know each other and figuring out what your jobs are and what you've got to do and your task at hand and so forth, there's going to be conflict, and it's important to know that you've got to work through that and do it in a way that doesn't destroy the team, but yet you can't avoid it and not work through it. So Couple of guidelines, generally speaking, most people choose to avoid it, but it's always best to work through it. And mediation and negotiation versus power struggle. There's very few times in my life that I've had to get to the point, that you just say, well, this is what we're doing, and I'm the boss, or I'm the manager, and that's what we're doing. Kind of like when your parents growing up say, well, because I told you so. And ultimately, you don't want to get to that point necessarily if you don't have to, but that's kind of a last ditch effort, looking for outcomes ultimately that are win situations where everybody involved feels like, hey, I had a part in that, and I didn't give up everything in order to come to uh, an agreement as far as the decision that we need to make. And ultimately, as I mentioned, on the other side of the continuum, you don't want it to be a lose-lose where nobody wins. So don't leave until there's resolution. If you're in a meeting, if you will, or you're with your group, and ideally you want to try to resolve things if it's humanly possible. There are times it's better to kind of disperse and come back, but ultimately make sure if you do that, you do come back. And then ultimately keys: humility, empathy, and inclusion. And I'm a kind of a relationship people side of things. And for me, those relationships are really important. And I think there's times you can agree that we are going to disagree, but the relationship still remains intact. And I think that that's important. So work in such a way to be able to do that. Abraham Lincoln had a quote, and this is a classic internet meme or whatever, but he made the I think he made the statement, I don't like that man, I must get to know him better. And sometimes I think just walking a mile in people's shoes, or like it politically, that's right now we're in a politically charged kind of context in our nation, and an election coming up, and just because someone's on one side of the aisle or the other doesn't necessarily mean that I can't work with or have a relationship with. And it basically means I want to take the time to get to know them a little bit better. So I kind of like that piece. One kind of aside, just managing a meeting, as you go into a meeting and you're in charge of running it, make sure that you're coming in with objectives. I would highly encourage a written agenda in most cases, so people know what direction we're going, and kind of have the game plan in front of them. And then before you disband or before you end the meeting, you want to make sure everybody's clear on their assignments, what they've got to do, and timetables. And I think that's an important piece to managing a meeting. SMART goals, I don't think we need to talk through that specifically, as that's something that we've even mentioned already this semester, and I think is a pretty common thing. But as you set goals in a meeting through your agenda, make sure that they're SMART goals. And I just wanted to touch on this piece, and we're getting close to wrapping up here, but we've done the Strengths Finder, and I think as you work with groups and you lead groups, it's important to understand the makeup of your group. And as we talked about in the first lecture, just understanding the skills and the assets and the talents of your group members, and understanding where they fit and how they fit. And ideally, these are the 4 domains in the Strengths Finder piece: executing, influencing, relationship building, and strategic thinking, and where people fall. And ideal teams ultimately have members from each of these domains. And, as an individual, you want ideally to have some parity across those 4. And, but I think it's also important to know that your groups, if you have opportunity to put groups together, that you have some representation, if possible. It's not always possible, but you have representation from each of these domains in the Strength Finder. And interestingly, I just wanted to share mine. Mine are harmony, belief, achiever, responsibility, and consistency. So as we go back, you look at those, where do those all fall? And you can see 4 out of the 5 of mine are in one domain, which isn't a bad thing, but it definitely shows that in these 3 areas, those are not my proverbial strengths. And if you were building a team with me involved, you would want to make sure that you have folks from these other domains as well. So as you're building and thinking about your groups and your teams. Yeah, you can look through that kind of just restatement of what we just talked through. Closing thoughts on team leadership, and I've got 4 from here. Just don't mistake activity for accomplishment. We've used the words efficiency and effectiveness quite a bit this semester. And that falls right into this. Don't, just because you're busy or you're doing things doesn't necessarily mean you're accomplishing things. Be purposeful in the work that you're doing, and work to be effective and efficient as a leader and as a manager. Don't mistake expediency for efficiency. We just kind of talked about that as well. Be thoughtful. Don't just pound through it because you want to pound through it. Think through and think about the ramifications of decisions and so forth. Teams are groups, but groups are not necessarily teams. It takes work to establish a true team. Be intentional. And I think that's, if you're a coach, if you've ever coached, it's work. And it takes time outside of the context. And if we're going to stick with the sport analogy, it takes time off the floor or off the field or whatever that might be to build teams. And it takes time, energy, and effort, and to be intentional with that. And then lastly, work to be inclusive. Inclusiveness, and we talked about this at some point earlier in the semester, but is a really important piece that we make sure that we are humble and are people of empathy as we work together in teams. And that should do it for chapter 8. Those are the 2 lectures. And if you have questions, again, feel free to reach out, and we will be happy to help however we can. God bless, and we'll talk with you soon.